One step past.
Action heroes of history. Cold-blooded. The Mounties and the Mad Trapper. This is a wild, action-packed story. It concerns the RCMP, short for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and best known as the Mounties. It's a manhunt in sub-zero temperatures with blizzards. There's gunfire, dynamite, an airplane, sled dogs, and numerous Mounties and trappers, all in pursuit of one very violent master criminal. The Mounties are the heroes of this story, led by Inspector Alexander Eames. The villain is best known to the world as the Mad Trapper. Only one thing was certain: the Mad Trapper wasn't going to be taken alive. Who is the Mad Trapper? Believe it or not, no one really knows the answer to that question. He became known as Albert Johnson, but that wasn't his real name. His life before the Mad Trapper days is a mystery. How old was he? It's speculated that he was born anywhere around 1890 to 1900, placing him in his 30s or 40s at the time of this story. He may not have been a native Canadian. Perhaps he was already a wanted American criminal. What's really puzzling is the fact that no motive for his crimes was ever established. Did he really do all these terrible things just for kicks? He wasn't a slobbering psycho mental case because he was too intelligent and too capable. Simply put, he was just a very mean and evil person. He had no respect for the law or anyone else. Physically, he wasn't a great-looking guy. He was medium-sized, stoop-shouldered, sun-reddened, and fly-bitten. He always had an angry expression on his face, as if he was always holding in some hostility. This man was rugged. How it all began. The man who would become known as the Mad Trapper was first noticed in the summer of 1931. It was July 7th when trappers William and Edward Snowshoes met a stranger they called Albert Johnson at a camp on the Peel River near Fort McPherson. They mistook him for someone who once trapped there named Albert Johnson. It didn't matter that this wasn't his real name, because that's how the world would come to know him, and he seemed to like the name alright. Johnson was moody and peculiar, but didn't give any indication that he was a nasty killer. Within the first 10 days of his arrival, Johnson had spent $1,400 at the trading post. The manager of the post, Bill Douglas, noticed that Johnson was carrying several $1,000s. This was weird, since trappers usually sent their money outside. Another quirk that was unlike most trappers was the fact that Johnson didn't want to talk and barely spoke to order supplies. Trappers can be alone for months, and usually, when one comes to civilization, they look forward to talking to people. Not this guy. If Johnson had been causing any trouble, it went unnoticed by the public at large. It was on July 21st when he went into Fort McPherson to purchase supplies. A Mountie constable named Edgar Millen, realizing he had never seen this man before, briefly questioned him about his activities. Johnson wasn't entirely uncooperative, but he didn't say much and he didn't give direct answers. He was also quite rude. Trappers could be odd and sketchy anyway, so Millen only advised him to buy a trapper's license and let him go on his way. If Constable Millen could have seen into the future, he would have more thoroughly investigated Albert Johnson. Sometime after that encounter, Johnson moved to the trapping grounds of the Rat River. He built himself a small cabin. In the near future, this cabin would be a hotbed of activity. For now, things still seemed quiet where Johnson was concerned. That's not to say he was totally law-abiding, but if he was doing bad things, it wasn't being reported. That changed on Christmas Day, 1931. Local First Nations Indians complained to the RCMP at the Arctic Red River Post. They said that Johnson had been interfering with their trap lines. When they went to his cabin to reason with him, Johnson threatened them with a rifle. The Mounties agreed to look into the matter. It was just 3 days later, on December 28th, that two Mounties and their sled dogs came to the cabin of Albert Johnson. One was Constable Alfred King. The other was Special Constable Joe Bernard. This time Johnson outright refused to cooperate. He wouldn't open the door to the cabin, and he wouldn't even speak to King. Constable King made a few observations about the cabin. It wasn't very big, maybe 8 by 10 feet. There were also holes at every corner, rifle loopholes to guard himself from all sides. Was Johnson anticipating trouble or looking for trouble? At any rate, King had to travel 128 kilometers, roughly 80 miles, to the town of Aklavik to get a search warrant. King and Bernard returned to Johnson's cabin on New Year's Eve, 1931, but this time they brought company. Constable R.D. McDowell and Special Constable Lazarus Sidichinley were added to their group. The Mounties anticipated some trouble, but they never could have expected how much. All King did was knock on the door. Johnson fired a shot that went through the door and struck King in the chest. The other Mounties exchanged gunfire with Johnson and then put King on a dog sled. They had to rush to get him to the hospital in Aklavik, 80 miles away, in a blizzard. Despite all this, they were determined to save King's life and made it to the hospital in just 20 hours. Incredibly good time. Fortunately, King survived, but the Mounties were baffled that Johnson would shoot an officer over a minor thing like a trapping violation. Shooting a policeman over something stupid put Johnson right in the crosshairs of the Mounties. Johnson wasn't known to the world at large as the Mad Trapper just yet, but this would have been as appropriate of time as any. Enter Inspector Eames. Albert Johnson promoted himself from butthead trapper to extremely dangerous criminal. It was then that Inspector Alexander Eames took charge of the manhunt. He personally led a posse to arrest the Mad Trapper. In his group were Millen, McDowell, Bernard, Sidichinley, along with 3 trappers by the names of Newt Lang, Ernest Sutherland, and Carl Gardland. Last but not least was their First Nations guide Charlie Rat. Things were about to get real. But let's roll back the hands of time a bit. Who was Inspector Eames? Alexander Neville Eames was born in Wales on December 26, 1883. He came from a fairly well-to-do family as they employed numerous servants. We don't know about his schooling, but it was obvious to anyone who knew him that he was well-read and a good speaker with excellent penmanship. He was a strictly sober person, honest, and a hard worker. At the time of this story, he was 48 years old and every bit a veteran Mountie. What were Eames' reasons for coming to Canada? That is another mystery, but he arrived in the country on August 5, 1913, and quickly made his way to Regina, Saskatchewan. He joined the RCMP and had a stellar career. It was clear that being a Mountie is what he wanted to do, and he was very good at it. He had a long and distinguished career, finally retiring in 1946. Eames and his wife never had children, but they lived a good life until his death in 1965. Now back to the Mad Trapper. Inspector Eames and his crew reached Johnson's cabin on January 9, 1932. Once again, a blizzard was raging. The Mounties meant business this time. So did Johnson. He had fortified the cabin. Eames demanded Johnson surrender. The Mad Trapper answered his demand with gunfire. The Mounties attempted to storm the cabin several times, but Johnson kept driving them back by shooting through the holes in his walls. The very next day, the Mounties threw dynamite at the cabin. They managed to blow the roof off the tiny building and partially collapsed its walls. Surprisingly, the Mad Trapper was unhurt and continued to fire at the police. Newt Lang, who had made it to the roof before blowing it up, was able to report on the Mad Trapper's weaponry. Johnson had a sawed-off shotgun in one hand and a revolver in the other. He also saw 2 rifles and guessed that there was a 22 gauge and a 30-30. What happened next? The Mounties gave up, at least temporarily. Allow me to explain. I can't have you thinking the Mounties were cowards. That just wouldn't be accurate. The temperature outside was minus 43 degrees Celsius. That's 45 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In other words, it was extremely cold, and getting colder. Food for the men and the dogs was running low. Inspector Eames made the executive decision to retreat to Aklavik. On January 14th, Constable Millen and Carl Gardland, one of the trappers, returned to Johnson's cabin. They soon discovered the mad trapper had fled. Worst of all, snowfall had covered his tracks. The media strikes again. I'm not a great fan of the media, and especially the press. Some of it is okay, but I don't think it's any secret to anyone that the press serves its own agenda. At the time the Mounties were pursuing Johnson, some newspapers and other media outlets were trying to make a folk hero out of him, like he was a poor, misunderstood unfortunate being bullied by the man, but had successfully punked the famous Mounties from his little cabin fortress. The newspapers nicknamed Johnson the Mad Trapper. Inspector Eames made it very clear that Johnson was a shrewd and resolute man, a tough and desperate character. Johnson was not a half-crazed hermit who was all right in his own way. Eames knew that this man was an experienced fugitive who was running away from some committed crime. People tuned into the story on a regular basis, and it got a lot of publicity. A positive outlet, however, was the amateur radio station UZK Aklavik, run by Army signalers. This station alerted all trappers to be on the lookout for Johnson, and they were really quite helpful to the cause of actually apprehending this criminal. Posse power! It was now clear that the Mounties were going to have to search for the Mad Trapper in an area of 260 square kilometers. That's 100 square miles, an incredibly big area, and it was still freezing cold. Eames organized a second posse. It included Sutherland, Sid Chinley, Trapper Noel Verville, 2 sergeants from the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals named Earl Hersey and R.F. Riddle, and 11 First Nations trackers. They joined up with Constable Millen and Trapper Gardland at the Rat River. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, what is the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals? A short explanation is that this group is a part of the Canadian Army. At this time, the Corps of Signals was combat support. It should be abundantly clear that Inspector Eames was playing to win. 19 men is a lot. Days passed and the Mounties were anything but idle. This was a hard job and they simply couldn't find the Mad Trapper. Johnson's ability to evade the police was almost unreal. He had no sled dogs and therefore no supplies to take with him. Johnson had to live off the land. How could he go so far for so long in such inclement weather? Eventually, the team split in 2. The food rations would last longer if there were less men in the area. Eames had it figured that the remaining party could stay for 9 days. Constable Millen, Sergeant Riddle, and Trappers Gardland and Verville were left to continue the hunt while Eames and the others went back to Aklavik. It didn't take Millen long to realize that Johnson was trying to make his way to Alaska, which was about 100 miles away. On January 30th, Millen's party caught up to Johnson. Millen called on the Mad Trapper to surrender. Apparently, Johnson must have thought he had to live up to his Mad Trapper reputation, so he promptly shot Millen through the heart with his rifle. Millen was dead. The other members of the posse thought they had Johnson trapped. The ruthless cop killer slipped away again during the night by climbing an almost vertical cliff. A little about Johnson's capabilities. Was the Mad Trapper making monkeys out of the Mounties and their posse? It might sound that way, but the truth of the matter is that Johnson was exceptionally good at being a fugitive. He obviously had some experience in this area. Not only was he a clever woodsman with incredible stamina, he knew how to elude people. Johnson knew how to backtrack, cover his trail, and leave blind trails. Whenever possible, he followed caribou trails to hide his own tracks. Somehow, he could sneak through underbrush that most people would think was impenetrable. He would stop and snare small game for food. Keep in mind that it was still extremely cold, and finding food was a trick within itself. Johnson built small fires, but to be hidden he only made them behind snowbanks. He was also able to travel in severe weather that made the Indian hunters stay at their camps. It's hard enough to stay alive under those conditions, let alone run from the police. The Mad Trapper was a survivalist in the truest form of the word. When Johnson killed Millen, the UZK radio station broadcast the sad news. Millen was actually very well liked by the trappers. Many of them were dangerously angry and went to Aklavik to offer their services to Inspector Eames. It was very easy for the mighty Mountie to form another posse of 11 men. Johnson may have been capable, but now he killed a Mountie, and a whole lot of determined people wanted to tear him apart. Here comes the airplane! A big part of the Mounties' problem in catching Johnson was that they had a lot of area to cover, and it was hard to move men and supplies on the ground, especially in freezing temperatures across snow and ice. It was for this reason that Inspector Eames requested the use of an airplane to help track the Mad Trapper. This was the first time the RCMP used aircraft in a manhunt. On February 5, 1932, a renowned bush pilot by the name of Wilfred Wop May landed in Aklavik in a Balanka monoplane. Wop was a World War I flying ace and part of the dogfight in which the Red Baron was gunned down. After that, he became a stunt pilot and bush pilot. His specialty was flying small aircraft into the most remote areas of northern Canada. Right now, he was part of the manhunt for the Mad Trapper. Before that, however, he had already been doing heroic things like taking medicine and other important items to people who needed it. He would continue to help the police in manhunts after the Mad Trapper incident. Wop May's addition to the team was vital. Even then, it still wouldn't be easy to catch up with the Mad Trapper. On February 14th, from his airplane, May sighted Johnson's trail where the Eagle and Bell Rivers connected. Johnson, who had always been good at hiding his trail, obviously didn't count on being seen from the air. Oops. Unfortunately, thick fog kept May and his Balanka on the ground for the next 2 days, but his discovery gave the Mounties something to go on. Inspector Eames' posse went up the Eagle River. Eames was wise and left directional markers on the ground for May so he could follow them when he was able to fly again. Doomsday for the Mad Trapper. It was February 17th, 1932, when Wop May was able to fly again. Everything seemed to come together on this day, because May was flying overhead when he saw the Mounties overtake Johnson on the frozen river. Albert Johnson was a troublemaker to the very end. He tried to run at first, but threw himself down in the snow. He quickly opened fire on the Mounties and used his backpack as a shield. After all this, Inspector Eames still wanted to take the man alive and demanded Johnson give up. The Mad Trapper ignored this order and, instead, shot Sergeant Hersey. It was an extremely serious injury, but he wasn't dead. From the air, Wop May gave Eames and his posse signals. The men on the ground spread out and caught Johnson in a crossfire. The determined fugitive was shot several times. One bullet severed his spine. Albert Johnson, the Mad Trapper, whoever he was dead. Hersey was quickly loaded into the airplane and taken to the hospital, where he survived. From one cold slab to another. After all the trials and tribulations in catching the Mad Trapper, one overarching question remained. What was his problem anyway? He didn't just make a mountain out of a molehill, he made a volcano. But to what end? Johnson's body was taken to Aklavik for the postmortem and to see what he had on him. On his person, Johnson had $2,410 in Canadian money, $10 in American money, 5 pearls of low value, some gold dust, and 2 pieces of gold dental bridge work that were not his own. It would be interesting to know where he got these items, especially the gold bridge work. One thing that wasn't found was any ID. The police took Johnson's fingerprints, but they didn't match anything in the Canadian or American police files. His real identity remains a mystery. Arthur Nelson. It might be speculation, but it's pretty good speculation, that the Mad Trapper was really an American named Arthur Nelson. When Constable Millen first met the man called Johnson in Fort McPherson, he thought the stranger's accent was that of someone from the northern United States. Way back in 1925, a man by the name of Arthur Nelson was trapping in British Columbia. Nelson moved north into the Yukon and is heard of no more. Then Albert Johnson shows up. An interesting fact is that someone who met Arthur Nelson said that he described himself as a Swedish-American farm boy from North Dakota. The physical description, skills, and personality of Arthur Nelson is right in line with Albert Johnson. The manhunt lives on. This story has all the makings of a successful action movie. The villain is just as interesting as the heroes. It has quite the cast of characters. Inspector Eames, Constables Millen and King, Wap May, and all the trappers and other people involved. You can't tell the story without them. However, you have to admire the ability of the Mad Trapper. He was a bad person, but if he would have used his skills for a good purpose, who knows what he could have accomplished in this world. If Johnson contributed anything, it would be that he made the RCMP step up their game, making them an even better police force than before. He also brought the Mounties together with a lot of different people, all of them being true action heroes of history.